guys, welcome back to the BuzWeaver channel, where we discuss activity that goes on here with the BuzWeaver channel. That includes things like current events, headlines that are in the news, pop culture, social media, technology, and items of interest that come up during the week that allow us to have a little bit of a dialogue. If this is your first time here to the channel, I'd like to welcome you here. And if you are following this on DTube, BitChute, and now on Parlay, I would ask you guys to give me a follow there as well. And if you are watching this on YouTube, you can click on that watermark down there in the bottom right-hand corner to subscribe along with notifications. That way all you guys will know when there's content here on the channel, as well as the Friday vlogs. On Monday of this week, I released a channel update. I've not done one in quite some time, kind of going over the content that's covered here on the channel, as well as what we had anticipated to be happening within YouTube and what we experienced as of last year in December until this year, which was very curious. So it doesn't seem, I guess, a little too unusual that things didn't quite work out the way we thought, considering in the way things are working out in general for 2020. But nonetheless, guys, you can check out that video up here in the top right-hand corner. One of the biggest news stories this week, last week, and maybe for the last 53 days for some individuals is all the activity that's going on in Portland. If you guys have been following the channel now for over the 2.5 years that we have been here, you know that we have discussed Portland quite a few times, and in particular around this time last year when the Proud Boys were doing their rally and then march there in Portland, and then of course the reaction and anticipated clashes with Antifa. However, now we're going to be talking about what has been going on there in Portland, because there's been a lot of back and forth even on social media, even on my Facebook page, of individuals who may not be entirely familiar with what has been going on, what we have been talking about here for the last 2.5 years, and how things have moved from being kind of a bit of a civil war in social media, where these individuals clash back and forth on a daily basis, and now having, of course, moved into reality here in 2020, where these individuals are now boots on the ground. So essentially what happened, in very simple terms, for 39 days, the rioters and Antifa, or as the media calls them, peaceful protesters, have been sieging the federal building downtown or in the area of Portland. Now, the president is the head of the federal government and can authorize authorities to go and protect the jurisdiction of the federal government, which was what he was doing. He was not sending these individuals there to police Portland. He was not necessarily sending them there to provide support to the police in Portland. The police in Portland were completely standing down. One of their offices was just recently attacked. So it wasn't as though the police themselves were playing a part within the jurisdiction of the federal government, as the federal government was there to do their job, and that is to protect their property that was trespassed on, it was spray painted, it was set on fire. These particular rioters and or insurrectionists were using kind of almost like a commercial grade or higher grade types of fireworks, along with, as I mentioned, spray painting, throwing water bottles, using tools, using hammers. Apparently they were able to break into a portion of the building prior to the president sending the authorities out, and then use a hammer to menace and or even attack one of the employees within the federal building. So it wasn't as though the peaceful protesters were being targeted as much as those who came onto the property to do a crime were then being arrested. Of course, you guys may have heard about the one Navy veteran who was what they like to exaggerate in saying that he was black bagged and placed into an unmarked van, which means, of course, that a bag was placed over his head, which it wasn't, and thrown into a van, which didn't necessarily happen in that particular way. And, of course, he was detained for a short period of time and then was released. So no one was actually arrested, mainly because the people of Portland don't want to seek indictments. Basically what it is the Portland people are so afraid that they don't want to speak out because these individuals might show up at their home, as we saw them show up at the mayor, Jenny Durkin's house, and then suddenly she wanted things done once they showed up at her house. But nonetheless, so the president sent these individuals there. Now, they were described by the media as undercover and covert. You know, I mean, stormtroopers, all of these exaggerated terms, and that they were, as I mentioned, undercover, but in reality, they were all in uniforms. There are plenty of images and pictures of them clearly in uniform, and some of those who had their badges and names on their uniforms were doxxed. If you're not familiar with doxing, that's where individuals or groups of people take personal information, for example, these particular police officers, and place them online. Their full names, their address, their place of employment, any personal data and information is shared. Now, platforms are supposed to suspend accounts that do this and or ban individuals who do this, but nonetheless, that is exactly what had been going on there in Portland. So it wasn't as though it was some big mystery. It wasn't as though President Trump sending in the authorities there that created any more of an incident, because the rioting had been going on, or at that point, 53 days or over 50 days. So it wasn't as though suddenly, as President Trump sent in authorities there to protect the building, that there was suddenly some new insurgence or new issue that was going on there. And we'll talk about that in this next segment. What I'd like to do now, guys, is read from some of the articles that I'll post below this video concerning the events there in Portland. And of course, if you guys watch the White House press briefings each day with Kayleigh McEnany, then you'll know some of the snide, snarky, kind of backhanded, they're really kind of statements in the form of questions that allow the reporters to kind of stick in their little jabs towards the president and what he is doing. Of course, their whole narrative is orange man bad. But of course, when I read this question, you will clearly see the kind of inflammatory, sarcastic language, because as you remember, Nancy Pelosi called the authorities that the president was sending in stormtroopers. Question. And my second question is, where in the Constitution does the president derive the authority to send federal law enforcement officers to the streets of American cities against the will of the elected officials in those cities? Now, keep in mind here that this is federal jurisdiction, so the president can completely send individuals to a federal building within that jurisdiction. He was not sending individuals, in this particular case in Portland, he was not sending individuals into the city or sending them in to support the police or just go in and have these particular authorities just kind of take over the city and quell whatever particular problems are going on. He sent them specifically to this particular jurisdiction. Now, I know that mayors in different cities throughout the U.S. in particular, and I say this for the purposes of description, many of these particular cities that are run by Democratic mayors and or Democratic governors within these states, of course, signed a petition. That petition goes to the Attorney General, and then, of course, they take it to the federal courts. Now, depending on the situation, the federal court's going to say, well, it's federal property, so there's really nothing here, dismissed. Now, as far as the president is not going to be sending in any types of authorities just for the purposes of sending them in some cavalier way of trying to quell all these issues. But of course, a lot of these particular governors and mayors and city officials, of course, don't want to be seen as incapable, incompetent, or even weak, much less being seen as needing the support of the president, because of course that in itself has its own set of issues. So Kayleigh's response was, yes, well, what you're referring to is Portland, and 40 U.S. Code 1315 gives DHS, that's the Department of Homeland Security, the ability to deputize officers in any department or agency like ICE, Customs and Border Patrol, and Secret Service. And she quotes from it, as officers and agents, they can be deputized for the duty of, in connection with the protection of property owned or occupied by the federal government and persons on that property. And when a federal courthouse is being lit on fire, commercial fireworks being shot at it, being shot at the officers, I think that I think this falls pretty well within the limits of the 40 U.S. Code 1315. And I agree wholeheartedly with her, because they are there in a defensive posture. But at the same time, as I mentioned in some of the conversations I've had with people, and you guys are probably aware of this, this is exactly what the rioters and Antifa wanted. They wanted the president to take an action so they could scream fascism and so that they could feign that they were victims and look at us, we're all oppressed by this evil individual tyrannical dictator President Trump. So, of course, in a way, I don't want to say I'm disappointed that he did it, but at this point right now, it is a defensive posture, and they can't surrender the building. I can't imagine that the president could pull out. Now, he could pull completely out and say, hey, I went in, I tried to do the right thing for this particular facility, and of course, I was met with opposition, so we went ahead and pulled out the individuals. But then, of course, what would happen, just like they did with the police department, they would just rush in and call it a victory. So I don't know if you guys want to call this a cold civil war, a warm civil war, but there's definitely activity that's going on. Now, a civil war doesn't necessarily mean that you have two fighting forces, with a skirmishing line where they're fighting over particular points or property, but it's clear that there's an activity going on here that is concerning. So I'm going to read from another article also. On Sunday, July the 20th, 2020, people gathered in front of the Mark O. Hatfield Federal Courthouse in downtown Portland. Hundreds of people stood blocking Southwest 3rd Avenue, while dozens of others tampered with the fence around the courthouse. At about 9:40 p.m., people in the crowd breached the fence enough to allow access to the area fenced off. The crowd chanted and pulled at the fence for about 90 minutes. So an hour and a half, they're tearing down basically the fencing around the courthouse. At 11:20 p.m., federal law enforcement came out of the courthouse for a few minutes and attempted to repair the fence, then went back inside. People have to remember something. They try to paint this picture as though these officers are out there in the streets hunting down these individuals. No, not at all. They're there to protect the facility because it has been breached. As you heard there, they had, broken the fence, but at the same time, they'd also had spray painted it. They had also used incendiary devices to try to set some of the boarding on some of the windows on fire. So again, these aren't peaceful protesters. When you're bringing all of these types of implements, fire, fireworks, katana swords, and all these types of implements of destruction, this isn't a peaceful protest. It is an insurrection. All right, guys, so we're going to continue with some of the articles here. One more. So, according to Bellingcat reporter Robert Evans, and I encourage you guys to check it out. Now, I don't entirely agree with the Bellingcat outline because, of course, it is kind of the left-leaning, progressive type interpretation, but it is accurate and it is time by time stamp and is very concise. So, according to Bellingcat reporter Robert Evans, at some point the protesters tore open the doors of a federal courthouse and then beat back the agents inside. Evans tweeted that the crowd is now throwing bottles at their hands as they try to shoot through murder slits in a wooden structure built around the courthouse to protect it. So what they mean by these murder slits is kind of an old school, going back to castles, where they have the little slits in the walls, and then the officers or the archers back in that day could see through these. So what they mean by murder holes, if you just want to kind of know the historical reference, when a castle has the main gate in the front, and when you come through it, when you come through the gate, there's that little entrance way, that atrium or whatever you want to call the hallway that from the gate to come into the castle proper. And they put these little slits there, and they're called murder holes. So if the gate is breached and the enemy rushes through, then the archers can be there to shoot the individuals going through. So they call them murder holes. But of course, this is all inflammatory language, as we talked about earlier when it came to the description of these particular individuals. But make no mistake here, these are not peaceful protesters. Yes, there were some individuals that apparently put on shirts. Now, I can't say whether or not these individuals were actually mothers or what part of the community these individuals were from, but these individuals had shirts on with mommy written on them, suggesting that mothers were concerned about the activities of the federal government being there, as though there was some kind of invasion force. They were even described as an invasion force, an occupying army. This incredible, exaggerated language. How can you expect these how can you expect these peaceful protesters to give any sort of credible tangible, objective information when this is the type of language that they're using. I mean, it's really a sad state. But of course, as we get closer to the election, it will be interesting to see how this continues. And of course, I can kind of see the media trying to escalate this. But as we talked about before, statistically, when individuals or Americans feel frightened and anxious about activity that's going on in the country, they have a tendency to lean Republican because they do want that law and order. Now, for the most part, when people were polled, they do want law and order in their cities. As a matter of fact, there in New York, where they defunded one of the special crimes units, they're begging the police to come back to protect their cities. Because once the police are defunded and they're not patrolling these areas, then the criminals come in and start doing their thing, you know, completely unabated. They're not going to be arrested. They're not going to have any issues at all. They can just do whatever they want to do. So they're asking the police to actually come back. So I'm hoping that people can get a better perspective of what is going on. So if you are watching this as a lay person, you know, if you're coming across this video and checking this out, I want you to consider the aspects of what is going on here. You have a group of individuals who are being reported on as peaceful protesters who are actually rioters, Antifa, and basically insurrectionists that are trying to create chaos and tumult. But nonetheless, guys, I will have all these articles and information below this video. All right, guys, so that's going to wrap it up for this Friday vlog. I know it was quite a bit of information going back and forth, but it was just one of those topics that really needed to be discussed. And hopefully you guys will be able to get some clarity, maybe a better understanding of what's going on. And of course, from the articles below, you'll get kind of a point-by-point bulletin, even an outline of what all has occurred there. So if you guys are watching this on DTube and or BitChute, as well as on Parlay, I want to welcome all of you guys to the channel and ask if you guys would give me a follow there on those platforms as well. And if you are here on YouTube, that would be the channel icon appearing right there on the screen to subscribe, along with notifications. That way all of you guys will know when there's content here on the channel, as well as the Friday vlog. And I will see you guys right there behind that camera next week.